This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 197 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is William Geroux. Bill graduated from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Before becoming an author, he spent more than 25 years as a newspaper reporter and editor in Virginia and northern Idaho, winning numerous awards for breaking news coverage, feature writing, and investigative reporting. He also worked as a writer for Maersk, the global shipping conglomerate. I invited Bill onto the podcast to discuss his book, The 15, Murder, Retribution, and the Forgotten Story of Nazi POWs in America, which was published in March of this year. The book covers the hundreds of POW camps that sprang up all over the United States during World War II, the inevitable escape attempts, and the conflicts between prisoners that led to multiple murders within the camps. But before we get into this story, you should know that OC Strategic Academy is here to teach you how to transform your career with the skill of a spy. With OC Strategic Academy, you can learn to understand people on a deeper level, influence decisions and build connections, and gain the edge you've been missing in work, in life, and in every interaction. Each course has been developed by a former war reporter turned human intelligence collector with extensive experience in the Middle East. The courses include Negotiate Like a Spy and Network Like a Spy, plus several others. There's also private one-on-one coaching available if you're interested in training that is tailored directly to your needs. You can find them at academy.ocstrategic.com. and use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to get 10% off any course you decide is right for you. Click the link in the show notes of this episode to level up your human intelligence skills. Bill, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course, this episode was a little bit personal for me almost because I grew up not too far from the site of one of these camps, and that was very cool to me growing up, but I had no idea just how widespread they were across the United States until I read your book. So this was a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
You were ahead of me because I didn't know anything about them until I stumbled onto a historical marker outside my local library one day and saw that there had been a camp just less than 2 miles from my house, a place I'd lived for 20 years and had no idea it was there. And sounds sort of unscholarly, but had no idea about that there were this many camps there. So the whole thing was a great surprise to me when I started, maybe in 2018.
Oh, wow. Very cool. I love those historic markers. Personally, they are everywhere, and so many people just drive past and never take a moment to stop and learn about what's been around them this whole time. It really is amazing.
Yeah, I can't resist those things. I'll stop and look at them just about under any circumstances.
Oh, really? Fantastic. You're actually the second author that I've had here on the podcast who wrote a book that started based on him reading a historical marker and learning something new.
Oh, that's great.
As a matter of fact. Yeah, very cool. Quite serendipitous, honestly. So you read that marker. Did you immediately realize that there was a book to be written, or did that come later on for you?
My first reaction on reading it was how do I not know this? Because, I've been fascinated by World War II all my life. My father was the 82nd Airborne, fought all over Europe, and never told me hardly anything about it, like a lot of men his age, but he told me just enough to give me just a lifelong fascination with it. So I had always been interested in it. I've seen countless movies, read countless books, written 2 books myself. And I thought, how do I not know that these camps existed? But my second thought was, I'm an author, and if I don't know about these, then probably a lot of other people don't know about them either.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me let's go to the big picture to begin with, just how many of these camps were spread across the continental U.S.?
Roughly 650. And of those, maybe 156, I believe, were main camps. These were like the big camps that held maybe 4,000 to 6,000 prisoners. But the others, which were scattered all over the place, were sort of branch camps that were located, a distance from the main camps. And they were located in these places to be closer to the workplaces where the Germans were going to work. And a lot of the smaller camps were, they held maybe 200 200, 300 POWs. And some of these were basically just tent cities surrounded by barbed wire.
Wow. Amazing. 650. That's incredible to me, honestly. I was expecting, maybe 100 or something like that, but clearly I was way off base there. So you could drive almost anywhere and be not too far from one of those camps, even if you didn't know it.
You could, and there's a map in the book that shows mainly where the main camps were, but I have a one that I didn't trust quite as well that showed where all the smaller ones were, and it's just amazing. I show it in my book talks sometimes, and people just go, "Oh my goodness," because they were literally everywhere.
Yeah, really stunning stuff. So for the German service members themselves that were interned in these camps, what did they think about their own treatment and living conditions while they were here in the U.S.?
A lot of them had been propagandized into believing that when they were captured, particularly at the beginning of the war, the first ones had been propagandized to believe that they were going to be mistreated horribly or killed or something when they got here. And when they arrived, they were just stunned by the good treatment they received. The United States had decided to follow the Geneva Convention to the letter, and the Geneva Convention required us to basically give these prisoners the same living conditions, minus, of course, the barbed wire, that American soldiers on the home front had. So this translated into lots of food, comfortable beds, all kinds of recreational and cultural opportunities. And a lot of the Germans were just stunned by this. They wrote home letters to their families saying, we're getting fat here. We haven't eaten this well since the war started.
Oh my gosh.
We can't believe how well they're treating us. Mom, don't worry anymore. But the hardcore Nazis in the camps, every good meal, every comfortable bed to them was evidence of America's weakness. They thought, well, the Americans must be treating us so well because they know they're going to lose the war. They don't want to make us but so angry. So there was nothing really that the camps could do. No amount of good treatment could sway some of these men, but the majority of them were very, very pleasantly surprised by the conditions here.
Wow. Well, that's a bit of a mental leap there, honestly, to be imprisoned 5,000 miles from home, eating really well and sleeping in comfort and thinking it's because they're so scared of me and my friends that they're treating us this way because they know they're going to lose. That's stunning, honestly.
The Nazis had an answer for everything. They anything that happened, they had a sort of a warped, twisted explanation for why it happened this way. A lot of them sailed into the ports here, like in New York, expecting to see the skylines, like sort of a post 9/11 thing, the skyline of New York smoldering or buildings missing or askew, and they were stunned that there appeared to be no damage.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by that. It's hindsight, obviously, from knowing how the war goes, but I guess your average ground troop would have no idea whether or not like strategic bombing was happening over the U.S., as it was over England and that sort of thing as well. But it's unthinkable to me because they never had a chance at a land invasion or that kind of long range bomber getting to the eastern seaboard. But I'm still amazed that guys would come into port in New York City and be like, wow, where's the smoke columns and where's the wreckage and all of that.
Right. They were so heavily propagandized, and many of them had been this way since they were kids. They'd gone through the Hitler Youth, and they'd either participated or watched as the Nazis overran Western Europe with relative ease, and they just believed in that the Nazis there was no way they could lose. And when you buy into something that thoroughly, I guess anything seems possible to you.
Sure, understandable. So earlier you mentioned that some of these smaller camps were located where they were expected to work. So these guys were not just prisoners, they were used as laborers, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be compelled to work. And the German army encouraged this as a way of, staying healthy and staying busy. The non-coms, the sergeants and corporals could work as supervisors. The officers didn't have to work at all, but the majority of these prisoners, there were 471,000 Germans, and the majority of them were enlisted men. So they became this huge workforce for the United States at a time when a lot of farms and businesses and factories were desperate for workers because they'd lost millions of their American workers, had joined the military or had gone to work in the the defense plants, which were booming and which generally paid better than farm work. We put them to work doing just about everything you could imagine. Most of them were involved in farming. They planted and picked pretty much every crop there was in the United States. Were credited with saving the apple crop and the cotton crop. But they also, they herded cattle, they cleaned bedpans, they shoveled snow on the northern plains, they cleaned up after hurricanes in Florida, they filled sandbags to hold back the floods of the Mississippi River. They were pretty much everywhere. And when I go out to talk to people about this book, everywhere I go, some people of a certain age have a story. Oh yeah, we had some Germans that came to our business and did this. So they were pretty much used all over the United States for every type of work you could imagine. They weren't allowed to do things that helped the war effort. They could, for example, help make gas masks, but they couldn't help make bombs or rifles. Geneva Convention said they're not allowed to do these things. Basically, we're not allowed to put them to work to help us win the war. But pretty much everything else they were allowed to do. And every morning they would be marched out of these camps under armed guard and put in a full day's work. And then every night they would be marched back in. So they were a tremendous boost to the United States, to the U.S. economy during World War II. By the end of the war, initially people were worried these were going to be this great national security threat. These guys were going to be escaping and raping and pillaging and sabotaging their way across the United States. But that didn't pan out. And by the end of the war, the camps were regarded as really political plums. They were economic plums, and politicians and chambers of commerce would fight over them. No, build a camp here. No, build it in my district. Build it in my city. And they were very, very popular. And there were not nearly enough camps and enough prisoners to satisfy the need.
That's amazing. I'm very surprised that it worked out well, because it does sound like a potential recipe for disaster. So were there incidents of, sabotage or mass escapes or any, big drawbacks to this program? You've got, like you said, hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers spread across the country, out working in fields and who knows where every single day.
Really nothing. There were no real serious crimes committed against Americans. The worst serious crime committed were auto thefts. People, escaped prisoners stealing cars to try to facilitate their escapes. Mm-hmm. But most of the time when they would escape, they were just completely on the run, because in the United States, this huge country, Stalag America, was nearly impossible to escape from. You might be able to slip outside the barbed wire or walk away from a work detail. But what do you do then? You're hundreds or thousands of miles from the ocean, or from the border of Canada or Mexico, both of which were at war with Nazi Germany. And you would, just hunted constantly, day and night by the farmers with shotguns, and the sheriff and the state police and the FBI. So these guys, the ones that did escape, and there were 1,073 recorded escapes, but the ones that did escape were so busy just trying to keep from being caught that really never had time to plan any sabotage. Occasionally on a work detail, you might have, a prisoner that would put something in a gas tank of an army truck or do something like that. But those were really more nuisances than serious sabotage attempts.
Okay, I see. That's fascinating how well it worked out, honestly. And I wouldn't say empathetic. I'm trying to see it from their perspective. They do kind of have a duty to escape, just like American POWs had a duty to try to escape and a duty to slow down the adversary and that kind of thing. So it's kind of understandable that they would attempt that sort of thing, because Americans and Brits and other Allied prisoners were doing the same thing in Europe. I got to tell you though, Bill, there were tons and tons of just emotionally charged stories and anecdotes throughout your book, but one that really struck with me was one of the farm laborers, and I don't know if you even put his name in the book, but one of the German farm laborers, he got to become almost like a trustee of the family, and they eventually let him hold their baby at the farmhouse one day, and he kind of started crying because he had his own baby that same age roughly at home that he had not seen in months or years potentially at that point. But that was incredible that a German POW could kind of ingratiate himself with the family to the point that he's, holding their baby in his arms in their home and having dinner with them and everything. It was really, really heartfelt, honestly.
And that really happened a lot, that sort of thing, because particularly in German American communities in the Midwest and elsewhere, the prisoners were welcome because they were young guys. They worked hard. Some of them, they were saving the family farms. So they were welcomed almost like long lost relatives who'd made bad life choices. And in fact, some of these families in the Midwest did have cousins and other relatives who were POWs. But this was,
oh my gosh.
It was, the shared effort of keeping a business going was a powerful bond. And I have one guy quoted in the book as one farmer's son as saying, I know I kept having to remind myself these guys were the enemy, but how can you think of them that way when they're saving our farm?
Yeah.
So they were embraced in many communities as, once it became clear that they were not going to, be out killing people or doing anything. And they were, some of the guards and even the farmers admired their soldierly discipline. And some of that was, I think, contributed to the Nazis taking control over these camps. They were almost encouraged to do it because they could get things done. They could pull a detail together and keep everybody working hard. And that was what a lot of these businesses wanted. That was what they needed. As long as the Nazis weren't going to escape and kill them, they were more than happy to have them there and bring them back, and wanted all they could get, wanted all the POWs they could get.
Man, that's incredible. Yeah, but a bunch of able-bodied, hardworking, very efficient and orderly kind of guys is just what the doctor ordered for just about any business under any circumstances. And here they were. Were these businesses, did they have to pay anything, or did the prisoners get any kind of a salary, or was this purely like a government program? We'll just drop off laborers when you need them.
The businesses had to contract with the government, and they paid them the wages of what civilians would make in those areas. And the Germans, really most of this money went to the upkeep of the camps, but the Germans got a small amount of money which they could use basically as scrip to buy things at the canteens in the camps. And they could buy everything from magazines to toiletries to, in some cases, 3.2 beer, because the Army's leaders believed that a German would work better if he could, during the day, if he knew he could have an ice cold beer at night. They got some minimal pay, but it was not in the form of money that they could do anything with except buy stuff in the camps.
Man, they had it pretty good as far as prisoners of war across the history of humanity are concerned, I have to admit.
They did, and during World War II, of course, the humane treatment of prisoners was far from a given.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. America
treated POWs in World War II better than any of the other major combatants by far.
Yeah, Bill, actually, speaking of treating the prisoners so well, another thing that absolutely stunned me, like I had to take a moment, honestly, when I read this in your book, was because 1940s, America is still a segregated country, and you had a couple of anecdotes about the prisoners, the German prisoners themselves being treated better by some people than the black military policemen who were guarding them. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I was just completely blown away by that.
It was really pretty appalling. Unfortunately, there were quite a few examples of that I found in the Jim Crow South. Of course, people, including black U.S. soldiers in uniform, were not allowed in restaurants and in bathrooms and to use drinking fountains. And there were a number of incidents where the black U.S. Army guards that were watching these prisoners, the prisoners were allowed to go places where the guards couldn't. And I have one example where a prisoner had to use the bathroom in I believe a train station. And it was a whites only bathroom. So he went in there and his guard could not go. And his guard stuck his foot wedged his foot into the door just so he could listen into the bathroom to make sure the guy wasn't climbing out the window or something. There are other cases where the prisoner had to, who were in transit between camps and a train station in Louisiana, sat in a restaurant and ate and smoked. And while one of the black U.S. soldiers was forced to eat in the kitchen at the train station.
Oh man, that truly is unbelievable how that would occur. And just the adversary, the guy that needs to be under armed guard at all time, gets a steak dinner and a cigarette at the main table, and the guard is in the kitchen, watching as the door swings open and closed just to make sure he doesn't
Right.
escape. That's just a stunning visual, really.
It is.
Wow. So you mentioned earlier, Bill, about the more hardcore Nazis, and some of these guys were true ideologues. Some of them, I'm sure were just draftees, conscripts, that kind of thing. They weren't especially ideological, but they were still caught, while fighting for Germany. But can you talk about the ideological division between the hardcore Nazi believers and the regular troops? Like how did that separate out? How did the Nazis kind of enforce their will or enforce discipline in the camps?
The first big wave of German prisoners were veterans of the Africa Corps, which was Hitler's at least once elite desert expeditionary force. And they had been fighting for years against the British and then against the Germans in North Africa. And we captured them. And a lot of those guys they had been through the Hitler Youth. They had really known very little except victory until their own defeat. And nothing really had shaken their beliefs. They felt confident that their own capture was just a speed bump, and that Hitler would set things right and let them loose when he brought America to its knees. So these guys were, and in the Africa Corps particularly, the first batch of 120,000 prisoners that came over here, a lot of them were real hardcore Nazis. But even in the Africa Corps, the German army was sort of cobbled together at that point. They'd lost a lot of men, and some of the replacements were, as you say, they were reluctant draftees. They were apolitical types who were fighting for their country, but they weren't really, they weren't members of the Nazi Party. They weren't really into its politics. And some of the prisoners were soldiers from other countries that had been conquered by Germany and had joined the German army, had been given a choice of joining the German army or being shot. So the devotion to the Nazi cause, even within the first batch of the prisoners in the Africa Corps, there was a wide range. But we, the U.S., the Army, did not recognize that at first. We thought, well, they're all a bunch of Nazis, and we'll just bring them over here and put them in camps, and it never occurred to us that there were great differences of opinion among them that would cause problems.
Yeah, I had to learn a lot of hard lessons very quickly. So over time, did anything like a de-radicalization program or denazification program develop, or did they just try to keep the troublemakers separate from the non-troublemakers?
The Army, once the violence in the camp started, once the hardcore Nazis began intimidating and attacking their fellow Germans who had kind of lost faith or were losing faith in Hitler, once that happened, the Army figured out that they had this dichotomy, these different views of even among the prisoners, and they started sending the really hardcore Nazis, the troublemakers, to special camps where they could all be held together. And there was one camp in particular, Camp Alva, in a remote section of Oklahoma that was known as the Super Nazi Camp. And if you had a camp in Georgia or in Kansas, and you found several of your prisoners were just constantly causing trouble and they were preaching Nazism, you could transfer them to Camp Alva. So the Army learned to do that, but even that was difficult because it was easy to identify the guys that were just constantly quoting Hitler and running around, doing obvious things. But the cleverer Nazis learned to sort of keep a low profile and operate within the camps and not reveal themselves. So it was very difficult, particularly for these camp commanders who weren't really trained to do this, to figure out who was who. Plus, once the war started turning against Germany, a lot of German soldiers who had been ardent Nazis, claimed to have never believed in it. So it was quite a challenge to to winnow out, to pick out the bad apples and to send them someplace. We eventually came up with a program to try to re-educate the Nazis. And that was a sort of a strange program that was, the level of success was a little unclear, but what we tried to do was a lot of the Nazis in the camps, the leadership had filled the libraries and the film libraries with all sorts of movies and books that were, that either glorified Nazism or, criticized America, and we'd winnow them out, and we'd sometimes even pick out the most promising, the Germans who seemed most attuned to the idea of democracy, and sent them to special schools where we would try to train them. And the idea was we'd train these guys and show them the virtues of democracy. And then at the end of the war, we would send them over to Germany to try to rebuild Germany as a democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very clever thinking, but like you said, it's not clear at all how successful it was. I did have to laugh. I think that just like you mentioned, because they had so much control over their own camps, I think that like the Americans had to go through all of the libraries and remove a bunch of books, including like Mein Kampf. They had that on the shelves in the library, and I'm a little bit surprised that it took them that long to get around to removing Hitler's autobiography from the camp library there, but
it is
better late
funny.
than never, I guess.
Some of these camps, the leaders, the ones that were really led by hardcore Nazis, they required the prisoners to sit for readings from Mein Kampf, or to hear lectures about national socialism in these camps. And it came as a shock to some of the other prisoners who did not feel that way, because they thought when we get to America, at least we won't be under the thumb of the Nazis. But they got over here, and the Nazis, behind the scenes, without the Americans being aware of it, were subjecting them to this. And they were saying, one guy said, I can't believe in the land of the free, we were to continue to be ruled by the Nazis. Mm-hmm. So it took a long time for the United States to end some killings before the army figured out how to stop this from happening.
Right. And so as you mentioned, the killings, that's one of the central kind of pillars of your book, of course, that there were multiple murders within the camps, like German on German murders in the camps. So I don't want to go over all of those, of course, during this interview here, but can you talk a little bit about how those developed, like what the motives were, who were the victims, and how did they transpire, that sort of thing?
Yes, there were 5 confirmed murders and 2 confirmed forced suicides. But honestly, there were more murders than that the untrained guards didn't recognize as such. And the Germans the Nazis in the camps, and not all camps were tightly controlled by the Nazis, but a number of them were. And in those camps, the Nazis the ardent Nazis would watch their fellow prisoners very closely, and they would listen to everything they said. They would watch them. They would watch their reaction to the war news. In the first killing was a forced suicide, and the Nazis had decided that this one German officer was losing faith in the cause, and someone stole his diary. He wasn't like out, proselytizing, out saying, we should join up with America, but he was, he wasn't obeying their orders quickly enough. They found his diary, and he had written in there that, that he felt Nazism would be the ruin of Germany, which was, of course, correct. But after that, they had a secret trial at night in the camp after the guards had withdrawn, and sentenced him to death. They gave him a chair and a clothesline, and told him that if he did not commit suicide, that they would get word back to Nazi Germany for the Gestapo to kill his wife in his place. Oh so God. He paced around for a while and finally hanged himself. Some of the other prisoners, that was just, in many cases, it was just prisoners who clearly had lost enthusiasm for the Nazi cause. A couple of the prisoners had actually betrayed the Nazi cause. They had, in fact, betrayed it. They were working with the Allies. And in those murders, the killers, the men who killed them, argued that these were not murders at all, that it was their duty as loyal soldiers of Germany to kill traitors, and that defense didn't work very well in the military courts where they were tried. But that was their argument, and I'm not sure that a number of Americans would disagree with their position, because what do? You've got a guy among you who is betraying you, and if you can't very well report him to the Americans because they're working with him.
Right.
So if you don't kill him, they'll just move him somewhere else. So their argument was, we had no choice. We had to stop this traitor. He was doing things that would end up killing our men. The U-boat men murdered a guy who was really working hard at betraying Germany.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is such to me, as a person who is not a lawyer, of course, this is such a complex legal thing, and in wartime, it is kind of a foregone conclusion what happened to these guys, as we'll get into, of course. But I felt like they were a little bit on shaky ground as prisoners who were brought to the United States, literally at gunpoint against their will. Are they really subject to our laws? Of course they were, and they were held accountable for that kind of thing. But I can understand a very spirited defense from them that, we found a traitor in our midst, and we made a decision and we took care of the traitor. That's something that would ring true for Americans, if somebody was collaborating with the Germans in an American POW camp, for example. But it felt like a very, very odd thing to bring to a kind of a public trial. Can you talk a little bit about the legal complications of trying these POWs? Like, were they tried by military tribunals, or were they tried in civilian courts in the jurisdiction where the camp was, for example?
The Geneva Convention said that they were subject to our laws. A lot of the Germans could not really get their heads around that. They thought nothing but a German court could really judge them. But the Geneva Convention said they were subject to our laws, but it didn't specify exactly how they were to be prosecuted. And we did not put them in the civilian courts, partly because we were concerned that the civilian courts might be lenient. They might see that they might think, well, yeah, of course they had to kill.
Can't give them a fair trial.
And we didn't even put them in the regular military courts. We had secret U.S. military tribunals that we organized, and these were basically hand-picked U.S. military officers, panels of maybe a dozen, and who were handpicked by the general in charge of that particular area, who had made it clear he wanted the killers brought to justice and wanted these murders stopped. It was a difficult situation for any of those Germans to be in, to present any sort of defense that would register with one of these any of these military tribunals. And in fact, all of them, every one of the 15 of them that were tried for murder were not only convicted of murder, but were sentenced to hang by these tribunals.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where the title for the book comes from, of course, the 15, I guess.
Yes.
And yeah, I have to kind of shake my head. Of course, this is very easy for me to say decades later, in peacetime, once the war has been won and all that. But, it's surprising how the odds were totally stacked against these guys, even though, yes, they did commit these crimes, but they never had a chance at a fair trial, like you mentioned. And I believe that you said that anytime the defense attorneys, like the Army officers who were defending them, if they gave a very spirited defense, they were not doing themselves any favors at all, because they were still members of the Army chain of command, of course. So they had to give kind of a weak, they were expected to give sort of a weak defense of their defendants.
Yes, they were expected to, because the Swiss, who were would sit in on these cases, needed to be reassured that this was being done properly. But my sense was that the defense attorneys, who were all military officers who had been lawyers before the war or during the war, were expected to put on a vigorous defense, but possibly not too vigorous, not vigorous enough to get these guys off. But it was been a tall order to get an acquittal. And some of these guys, some of the Germans, some of them many of them had committed cold-blooded killings. Most of these killings were just by necessity, where they beat guys to death, they strangled them to death. They were brutal killings. I mean, it's an overused word, but a lot of these guys were just beaten to just savagely beaten and strangled.
Yeah. And one guy, I think, skull fractures from having his head rammed against like the barracks wall or something like that until his skull broke, I think.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah,
gruesome, without a doubt.
because you would get they would turn loose. In one case, the highest ranking German in the camp in Oklahoma called a meeting and to expose this one prisoner as a traitor, a guy who had been trying to had sent written allegedly. It was not entirely clear, but it was probably him. He had tried to smuggle a note to the Americans suggesting bombing targets in Germany, to try to shorten the
Yeah,
war.
yeah, yeah.
So once this was revealed at a mass meeting with like 200 German POWs, in the middle of the night with no guards around, they immediately turned on this guy and just savagely beat him to death.
Yeah, Bill, do I recall correctly from that one? I might have the details mixed up. He was suggesting bombing targets like in Hamburg, and the camp command, the ranking German in the camp was from Hamburg, and his family was back there right then.
Yes,
And
and
they found this note
Hamburg.
suggesting bombing targets there. Oh my God, that guy signed his own death warrant for sure.
Yes, and Hamburg had already been bombed, ferociously, with
Hmm.
great loss of life. So there was a lot of the prisoners, even who weren't from there, they had all, a lot of them knew what was happening in Germany. They knew that they had lost loved ones, they'd lost their homes, their farms to the Allied bombs. So they were very unsympathetic to this guy. And it
Yeah,
turned
yeah.
out that the guy had gotten this information. He was not the prisoner who had sent the note was not from Hamburg. He had gotten this information out of an old Life magazine that had been, that had come out before we got into the war, and it was like a feature about how the Germans were camouflaging Hamburg to
Oh
try
my
to,
gosh.
against at that point the British. So it wasn't any sort of great military secret, but the fact
Hmm.
that he was willing to do this, and he was also expressed an interest in helping the Allies further. He said, "If there's anything more I can do, please let me know." So he was, I would say, an aspiring trader rather than the U-boat man who was a very accomplished trader.
Yeah, yeah. How do I put this? I felt the least amount of sympathy for him of any of the victims mentioned in the story. I guess that's the best way to put it. But you simply cannot do something like that. And if people find out in the camp with you, you're not going to survive. That's
No,
impossible. So I do understand, how that built up into that mob rage there as soon as everybody found out. But there were several others as well. I had, prior to reading your book, actually, I was already familiar with the story of Werner Drestler in Arizona. Can you talk a little bit about what happened to him there at that Camp Papago Park?
sure. Bernard Dressler had been a crewman on a U-boat, a milch cow U-boat, which was sort of an oversized U-boat who's basically would haul supplies to other U-boats at sea and also lay mines. And his U-boat had been sunk, and he was brought to the United States. And almost immediately, all of the U-boat crewmen were brought here, as were all of the higher generals and many scientists, were taken to a top secret interrogation facility at Fort Hunt, right outside Washington, D.C. And I grew up around there. And as a kid, I used to play at Fort Hunt Park. They had since demolished the facility, but he was taken to this place, and he said, I volunteered to them. He said his father had been imprisoned by the Germans for being a social democrat. So he had claimed that he had joined the U-boat force reluctantly, and that he wanted to get back at the Nazis for what they'd done to his father. So he agreed to become a stool pigeon at Fort Hunt. And what they would do is they would gather some newly captured U-boat men in a room and send Werner Dressler in a bugged room and to start talking to them. And he would, talk to them a little bit about his experience, sort of establishing his bona fides as a U-boat man. And then he would start sort of asking them questions to, like, what's, this well-known U-boat captain, where's he at these days? What new technology does a U-boat have? Where are the U-boats going? Ask him these questions that would aid the Allies. And it was a very difficult task to do this subtly. And I'm not sure he was very good at it. And after a while, a number of the U-boat men became very suspicious of him. He used a false name, and the word got out that this guy was a traitor. And he was, after about 6 months, the Navy stopped using him as a stool pigeon and sent him into protective custody at Fort Leonard Wood. And he was supposedly going to, stay there for the rest of the war and be safe because he had provided considerable help and a lot of information to the Allies. He'd even told them where the most popular brothels were in some of the U-boat bases in France. Anyway, they moved him into protective custody, but the Army at one point decided to put all of the captured German Navy prisoners in Camp Papago Park in Arizona, which is just east of Phoenix, so close to Phoenix that you could see the Phoenix skyline from the camp, and put them in there. And in the files, there are all these documents from the Navy saying, do not put this guy anywhere near other U-boat men because, he'll be killed. But then the Army either disregarded that or lost track of it. And they send him to Camp Papago Park. And he immediately was recognized by some of the U-boat men that he'd been trying to weasel information out of at Fort Hunt. And within an hour, everybody in the camp knew that the Americans had delivered basically a traitor into their midst. So within 6 hours, they had beaten and strangled him to death. And the Germans thought it was so odd that he was put there. They thought it was crazy that the Americans would put him there. And some of them believed that the Americans had just gotten all the use they wanted out of this guy and didn't know what to do with him and put him in there for the Germans to murder. I don't think that was true, but they did. They murdered him again within 6 hours of his arrival there.
Man,
seven U-boat men killed him and were convicted and sentenced to death for murdering him. But he was a thoroughgoing traitor, and they were the ones that argued most persuasively, at least in my mind, that they hadn't murdered him; they were just doing their duty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, complex situation there, no doubt about it. And that is astonishing that they would send him right into the lion's den, so to speak. And I think you're right. I don't think it was intentional like that. Even if they were, had used him up as a source, so to speak, you can sort of attribute a lot of stuff to apathy and incompetence that might look like malice.
First look for incompetence.
Right. It definitely happens. But in the end, it was absolutely a horrible end for Werner after he had contributed a lot to the American cause. And then I can't imagine what was going through his mind, those last 6 hours that you mentioned. Like, was this a horrible mistake? Did they decide that they had used me up? How am I going to live through the night? And then obviously he didn't. So just an incredible end for that guy.
Yeah.
Well, so as we mentioned, Bill, the 15 Germans were sentenced to death here in the United States, but that wound up with this incredible situation that is kind of at the heart of the book with 15 American POWs that were being held by the Germans. So can you explain how this turned into this dramatically complex hostage diplomacy that was kind of the heart of the book?
Yes, the Geneva Convention, after these military tribunals sentenced these 15 German POWs to death, to hang, we sent them to Fort Leavenworth, the maximum security military prison there in eastern Kansas, to be hanged. And the Geneva Convention required us to notify the government of Nazi Germany that we intended to execute these German POWs. The Germans, once they learned this, and some of the defense attorneys for the Germans had predicted this, but the Germans, once they learned about this, immediately they kept asking for more information. We said we're going to execute these guys. We sent them some bare bones information about what crimes they were charged with, what they'd been convicted of, and the Germans kept asking for more information. They'd say, well, what were the circumstances of this case, of this killing? What evidence was presented? What defense was offered? But we just sort of brushed them off, and we said, we don't have to tell you this. We've done all we need to do. And finally, the Germans decided to take matters into their own hands. So they, in the 29th and 30th of December of 1944, they rounded up 15 American POWs that were in their custody and hauled them before secret German military tribunals and sentenced them to death. And then once they did this, they approached the Americans, and all the communications between Nazi Germany and America went through the Swiss, the mediating party. And they sent a message through the Swiss saying, you've got all our guys that are sentenced to death. We've got a bunch of your guys that are sentenced to death. Let's trade.
So that is something, I mean, we've seen, people take prisoners more recently in the future. Was that was warned about and nobody in the U.S. took that seriously? Is that how that occurred? I mean, was that kind of unthinkable at that time to them?
Some people in the United States, some people in the U.S. leadership in the War Department and the State Department were aware that this was a possibility, but they were kind of generally aware of it. And honestly, there was so much going on with the war that this was not, perhaps they didn't take this seriously. They certainly didn't take it seriously. They never imagined it happening this way. They didn't see a situation where you'd have 15 Americans that have been sentenced to death. And some of these Americans, a couple of them were spies or at least secret agents, but most of them were Americans who had committed relatively minor offenses. And the death sentences in those cases were extreme. So it was pretty clear that the Germans, this was not just the normal court proceedings. This was a clear effort by Germany to just drag 15 Americans, the ones they could find, into court, sentence them to death, and use them as bargaining chips. Some of them had done very little. One of them had given a speech where he had insulted the Germans and said that he didn't care if he sat in this POW camp for 10 years, if during that time the entire German army was wiped off the face of the earth. Those were almost his exact words. And for those words, he was sentenced to death. A couple of other guys were sentenced to death because they had briefly, symbolically, stood in front of a German sergeant who was getting ready to post a insulting propaganda poster on the POW's bulletin board. They didn't really prevent him from doing this. They just stood in his way and said, this is wrong, and then got out of the way, and he put them up. And for that, they were sentenced to death. A couple others were sentenced to death for getting into scuffles with guards on work details. And these offenses typically would get you 10 days on bread and water in the cooler, or in maybe a prison sentence, but not a death sentence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Was the intention here, was this going to be some sort of trade in the way that, spies were exchanged later on in the Cold War and that sort of thing? Or did the Germans simply expect them to, what's the word I'm looking for, just negate the death sentence on these prisoners, and in exchange they would negate the death sentences for the American POWs as well?
No, it was to be an actual exchange.
Okay.
The Germans first proposed the exchange, but once it was proposed, and initially the War Department, led by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, was so outraged by the inequity of this, that the Germans want us to release these 15 murderers, so that we can get back these Americans who hadn't really hurt anybody or done anything. So at first, the War Department said, "No way, we're not even going to entertain this." But the State Department looked at it a different way and said, it's ridiculous, it's unfair, it's a completely unfair exchange. But how's it going to look if these guys, these 15 Americans, get executed, and the American public learns afterwards that we had a chance to save them, we had a chance to make a trade, and we didn't do it. So finally the War Department went along with it, and we actually proposed an elaborate exchange of 15 Germans for the 15 Americans, and it was going to be done at 2 points along the Swiss border simultaneously. The Germans were to be brought from Fort Leavenworth back over there and exchanged, and the Americans were to be gathered up from the various camps they were at and exchanged in a different spot. So this was what we proposed, and we kept saying, well, we think this is terribly unfair, but we're prepared to do it.
Hmm. Wow. So, did those exchanges ultimately take place?
No, they didn't, because this was going on. The negotiations were very kind of confused at the time. They were taking place in the spring, most of them in the spring of 1945. And at that point, Germany was rapidly losing the war. It was hemorrhaging territory and men, and it was the Russians were pounding them from the east, and we were pounding them from the west. And Berlin was just being bombed daily and was practically in ruins. And the advancing Allied armies, the Russians, the Americans, the British, and the Canadians, were advancing and liberating some of the camps where the 15 Americans were being held, and freeing them. Although freeing them was in those days, because Germany was descending into chaos. So if you were in a camp and you were freed basically to try to stay alive
Hmm.
in the chaos as Germany collapsed. And in many ways, it was even more dangerous than being in a POW camp.
Hmm.
But the events on the ground, the advances of the Russians and the American armies basically took over the exchange, and gradually the German communications system collapsed. So at one point, the Swiss, who were trying to, trying to intercede and trying to organize this exchange, said that they could no longer reach as they put it, the responsible people in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And furthermore, they could not say for sure where all of these 15 Americans were. And the Americans were finding out that some of the 15 Americans had been freed, had been liberated, and were in Allied hands. Before the negotiations could be completed, the events on the ground basically ended the whole idea of negotiating, and released the Americans and left the Germans at Leavenworth to their fate.
Wow. So, were they ultimately executed themselves, or did the end of the war kind of put a stop to those executions as well?
No, somewhat curiously, I found as soon as Germany surrendered, the Army Provost Marshal General's office, which was in charge of the prisoners, set out to execute these Germans as quickly as possible. They wanted to do it. They didn't see the end of the war didn't really change their views
Wow.
about this at all. So Harry Truman, after FDR died, Harry Truman commuted the sentence of one of the 15 Germans to 20 years, because Truman's advisors told him that the evidence of murder was so circumstantial that it really wouldn't support a death sentence. So one of their lives was spared, but the other 14 were hanged. And they were hanged in three groups. The first five, the men from the Oklahoma camp, and then some men from a camp in South Carolina, and finally the last seven, the seven U-boat guys from Camp Papago Park were hanged. They weren't hanged all at once. They were hanged one after the other in a very, very efficient manner. They hanged all seven of them in a space of a little under 3 hours at Fort Leavenworth. And at the time, there was so much going on. We were still fighting the Japanese. The atomic bomb was we were dropping that. So the American public was really not focused on these cases at all.
Right.
And the news coverage of these hangings was, the New York Times buried the stories back in in A12 or A14 or something. It just wasn't, at the time, wasn't regarded as a big deal. And certainly no Americans had no sympathy for these Nazis, because every day, the more and more evidence was emerging from Europe about the atrocities the Nazis had committed. So there was really zero sympathy for any of these guys. So the Army had originally planned to have the hangings done, in secret, or until after the fact. But in the end, they felt comfortable inviting reporters to come witness them. Fortunately, because they described this in tremendous detail, the people who covered these stories. So we hanged 14 of the 15, Even though there was one Army officer raised the question of, well, since we had a deal with the Germans that we weren't going to execute anybody while these negotiations were going on, did we have did we have to keep our end of this deal? And he said, basically, I don't know what the answer is. It should be a higher authority making this decision. But the higher authorities decided to go ahead and hang them. So hang them they did.
Yeah. Wow. And that's, as you mentioned with the reporters there, towards the end of your book, of course, going over the hangings, you've got a little, a few paragraphs about each guy and their last words there as they went to the gallows. And it's pretty poignant stuff. It's tough to read a guy's last words, regardless of what he did and the acts and what brought him to that point in life. But that was a kind of a hard read for me, honestly. These guys are right there facing the noose and what they had to say about it at the moment.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of readers who said they really didn't feel that good after reading how we dealt with them, because you could make the argument at the end of the war that there wasn't any deterrent effect that we needed to do, and some of these guys, some of them had really taken part, had just really been principals in these murders, but other guys were just, they were just part of the crowd. They had one guy who the only evidence against him was his own confession, which he was foolish enough to give. And he said that he had watched one of the guy in the victim in Oklahoma being beaten to death, and he had stood up on a table. He couldn't get close enough to hit him, so he stood up on the table and he grabbed a couple of cups from the kitchen and threw them at the guy and missed. So his contribution, as far as anybody could tell, to the killing was throwing a couple of cups in the direction of the victim that had no impact on what went on. So,
oh my gosh, and they got him
in most courts. That would probably get you something less than a hanging.
Yeah. Wow. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
It was wartime, and it was interesting because as soon as the war ended, a couple of the cases, the murders that had not been solved, the cases were reopened. And one of the murders was solved, and they found 8 guys, I think, that had in fact beaten a German POW in Texas to death. And they were tried before a military tribunal. But the war was over, and the military tribunal convicted them of murder, but instead of sentencing them to death, gave them a prison sentence. And these guys ended up being released back to Germany within 3 years.
Oh my gosh. What a drastic
the war fever had kind of died out at that point. And the treatment of the German POWs who'd been involved in these killings changed dramatically after the war.
Understandable. So, Bill, you mentioned, I think you said 471,000 came over. How quickly were these guys repatriated? The normal, non-murderers anyway. How quickly were they repatriated to Germany as the war ended?
Initially, after Germany surrendered, I think a lot of them expected they'd be sent home. But we were, of course, still fighting the Japanese, and we immediately shifted all our resources toward that. So we informed these guys that they were going to have to stay in the United States for the foreseeable future until we had the bandwidth, basically, and the personnel and to get them back. So many of them ended up staying here for a year or longer before they were sent back. And it was a real question about not only when to send them back, but who to send back first. The Army initially thought, well, we'll send back the hardcore Nazis first because they're useless anyway. They won't work. They won't do anything. But then people said, well, wait a minute, you're rewarding these guys, these obdurate Nazis by sending them back first. So we ended up sending back like coal miners and engineers and people that we thought could help rebuild Germany, which was in ruins. But the return really took a couple of years. And a great many of these guys, we didn't return them to Germany. We turned them over to the British and the French, who put them to work. And some of them worked for years after that in Europe, rebuilding Europe, rebuilding the damage that the Germans had done. The French kept them there for years. And we finally had to intercede with the French to finally send these guys home.
My gosh. So some of these guys, they would have, presumably, they would have enlisted and shipped off to the front one way or the other, and they would not come home for 6 or 7 or 8 years after that. I guess it
Yes.
sounds like, right? To a vastly different Germany. God knows how many of their family members survived and are still home, and whether their home is intact or not. But my gosh,
Yeah, many of them, a lot of them wanted to stay in the United States. They'd grown up in Nazi Germany. They get to the United States and they meet these people, and the people don't hate them. Not only that, but the Americans, they can think what they want. They can do what they want. They're free. And a lot of the Germans, wow, this is, we've never seen anything like this. And they wanted to stay. But the United States said, nobody can stay. You all have to go back. And if you want to come back here and resettle, you can, but you've got to apply for citizenship. You've got to get a sponsor. So we sent them all back, but a number of them did. It's a little unclear how many there were. We didn't keep very good track, but some estimates have said that like maybe 5,000 former POWs returned to the United States, went through this process and returned to the United States and resettled here. And
wow.
there's a great story in the book because when they first went back, again, Germany was in ruins. There was no food, there was no place to live, there were no jobs. And a lot of the German POWs who'd been working in the United States had made friends, or at least made acquaintances of the farmers that they'd worked for, and they had pretty good relationships. So they would write to the Americans from Germany, and they'd say, "Oh, things are terrible here. I haven't got food to feed my baby. I can't. We're miserable." And the Americans, one case, a group of farmers in Kansas, and a lot of groups of farmers did this, but group in particular in Kansas sent a care package to this prisoner in Germany, with some food and some other stuff. The care package was the arrangements for the thing were handled by the farmer's daughter, and the farmer's daughter, exchanged letters with this former POW, and gradually the letters got longer and more personal, and finally the farmer's daughter went to Germany, married this ex-POW, and brought him back to the United States. The daughter's father, who ran the farm, died, and the former POW took over and became the farmer, basically on the land where he has once worked as a POW. And today, 2 of his sons farm that land. So there are a number of Germans. There are a lot of stories like that. I have some love stories and some other stories. There's one story about an SS man who resettled I believe in Nebraska, which struck me as a little odd given what the SS was like. But
my gosh, what a story! Yeah, never would have imagined the first time that work crew showed up at his farm that one day that man himself would be the farmer and his descendants would be the farmer as well. That's incredible.
It's amazing.
Wow, what a story! Bill, this is a wonderful book. Honestly, there are so many poignant and heartfelt moments through it, and so many vastly complex situations that everyone had to work through to the best of their ability. I really loved it. It's such a page turner, and just, congratulations to you for putting this together, because I could barely put it down. Honestly.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I learned a tremendous amount doing it. I didn't even know about the 15 American hostages until I was well into the research, and I found it just in a mention of them in a document. And I thought, what? There was an attempt to exchange these guys. So it was, for me, exploring this and researching it, it was just one surprise after another.
Wow. Incredible stuff. So yeah, I absolutely loved it. For the listeners out there who want to pick up the book, I can't recommend it enough. It's called The 15: Murder, Retribution, and the Forgotten Story of Nazi POWs in America by William Geroux. This has been fantastic, and the book's already out. Of course, it's been out for a couple of months now. Are you moving on to another project now, or what do you have planned for the future now that this is out on shelves?
I don't really crank these out, so I've got a couple of ideas that I'm exploring, but they're really at the point where, just a single phone call, I would call somebody up and they could tell me something that would just scotch the whole idea. So I don't really have any topic right now that I can cite to you that I think has any serious possibility necessarily of being written. But maybe another month or two, I'll start plunging into that in a little more detail.
Okay, great. Well, whatever it turns out to be, I'm sure it'll be a real page turner, and I look forward to it.
Well, thanks very much.
Sure. Do you have any social media pages or a website you want to share with the listeners if they want to follow along on your next project, for example?
I mean, I'm on Facebook, and there's a williamgeroux.com, which the publisher operates. So, but that's really about it. I probably need to up my game on social media a bit.
Well, I know you have an Instagram page as well. I just found it yesterday, as a matter of fact. So I'll try and direct some people there. That way, if you run it yourself, I'm sure people would love some updates from me every now and again.
Well, thanks.
Absolutely. So thanks again for your time, Bill. I really appreciate it. And I just cannot recommend this book strongly enough to all my listeners.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Take care.
All right.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.